anyone with just a cursory knowledge of the Holocaust understands that it's the stories, and particularly the stories of individual people, that personify what happened to 6 million Jews in Europe during the Second World War. And in particular, it's the accounts of the children that have the greatest impact and helping us make the Holocaust real. So with this in mind, I gathered from various sources the stories of children of Holocaust transports who after the war came to live in New Zealand. I realised that I had access to information from personal contacts as well as oral history testimonies done by the Auckland Holocaust Oral History Group, and so I worked with the kinder themselves in some cases, with their interviews and also with their families. And I'd like to dedicate this presentation to them, and particularly to the families of Michael Goldsmith and Elsa Brower, who passed away in the last year, and the last two living of the kinder who came to New Zealand. So imagine, if you will, leaving your home, your family, travelling on your own to an unknown country where you will live with strangers who speak a strange language which is not your mother tongue. You don't know if there is to be war. You don't even really know what war is. You only know fear. And you don't know if you'll see your family ever again. And imagine being a parent, sending your precious child into the unknown, and again not knowing what will become of them if you have saved them. So this is what happened to the 10,000 children from Europe who escaped the Second World War. The parents had to stay behind, but the Germans allowed a certain number of children to leave on what has become known as Kindertransportees, the transport of children to safety. And after the war, 13 of these children came to make a new life of freedom in New Zealand. And these are their stories. I'm going to just briefly set the context with some bullet points because I haven't got time to do anything more. 1933, Hitler effectively gained power in Germany. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed, legalising the ideas of a superior Aryan race and excluding German Jews from citizenship and preventing any relationships between German Jews and non-Jews. And this slide is one that pertains to Peter's family. His aunt, by the time this was issued, was living in Belgium and survived the war, but this document declares that she is no longer a German citizen. In 1938, with the Anschluss with Austria, the anti-Jewish laws were enacted there. And on the 9th of November of that year, on the night we commemorate as Kristallnacht, the SA and SS men set fire to 1,000 synagogues, smashed up 7,500 Jewish businesses, fatally assaulted 90 Jewish men, and herded 30,000 Jews into concentration camps pending ransom. So this is a photograph of Peter's grandfather's shop, which was defaced on Kristallnacht, and you can see, it's not a very good photograph, but you can see his grandmother standing in the doorway and the word Yud written clearly across the front. So the kinder who settled in New Zealand, We know of 10 who came and settled here: Elsa Brower, Robert Fental, Walter Freytag and Lenore Ball, Michael Goldsmith, Liesl Green, Eva Heyman, Hans Hirsch, who became Herb Hurst, Vera O'Brien, Gerhard Wachsner, who became Gerald Warner. 3 others came to New Zealand initially, but moved away sometime later. Eva Binder to Sydney, Anita Chard to Sydney, and Ruth Hirsch to the US. So Kindertransport, as we understand, was the unofficial name given to a rescue effort between 1938 and 1940 that saw approximately 9,000 to 10,000 children brought from Europe, mainly to Great Britain, where the Germans agreed to allow a number of children to leave. There were a number of groups that worked together to make the Kindertransports a reality, and these included Jews, Quakers and other Christians of many denominations. Ways were set up to select, process and transport the children. About half lived with foster families and the rest stayed in hostels, schools or in farms. Homes are visited and checked, but because of the haste and the ad hoc nature of the project, it didn't always go according to plan. Children were not always matched to appropriate families, and often they were moved on to other families, but in some cases they just suffered through the end of the war. The children ranged in age from very young, from about 2 was the youngest one that we're dealing with today, up to age 15. Often older siblings arrived holding a younger sibling by the hand. Then they arrived wearing a tag around their necks, which corresponded to a label on their luggage. Children were identified and grouped by list and issued with a travel date and departure information. The first train left from Berlin on the 1st of December 1938 and the first from Vienna on the 10th of December of the same year. Trains were accompanied by a few volunteers who, once they had delivered the children, had to return home. Kindertransports also left from Prague in the final months before war was declared in September. So the Kindertransports basically happened from December through to the September of the next year, so over 9 months. We know about Nicholas Winton, who was an English stockbroker of non-practicing but Jewish background, and he determined to bring out children from countries under German domination or which were in danger of being in countries invaded by Germany in the near future. And in December 1938, he raised funds and organised 8 transports from Prague altogether. And today his name is famous for having organised and overseen the rescue of 669 children from Prague. And you can find out more about him on the Holocaust Centre website. In 1940, the British began detaining people from countries that were enemies of Britain in internment camps on the Isle of Man and in Canada and Australia. About 1,000 of the Kinder were interned. Some later joined the British Armed Forces and fought in the war, and some even lost their lives. So the first person to talk about is Elsa Brower, née Goldsmith. She was born in Breslau in Silesia on the 1st of June 1927. Her mother tongue was German. Her father had a wholesale business dealing in textiles. It wasn't a very observant family, but they belonged to a synagogue and kept a kosher home. After 1933, Jews were no longer allowed to go to Christian schools, so Ilse was sent to the Jewish school. There was a big Jewish community in the city, several synagogues, and even a Jewish hospital. The household had a maid who hid Ilse's father during Kristallnacht, but later on he was taken, and although he eventually returned after a month, he obviously had suffered a lot from cold and from the beatings and sleeping rough. And at that point the family made efforts to leave Germany. Ilse's brother Hans left on a Kindertransport in February 1939, and Ilse followed in June of that year. Their parents were lucky to get tickets to Chile, courtesy of a lawyer uncle, and they left on the last boat to leave Genoa before war was declared on the 3rd of September, 1939. Hans went to the Balfour Institution in Scotland, which was a home for Jewish children outside Edinburgh, donated by Lord Balfour. The first family Ilse stayed with was a family of German Jewish immigrants. She was initially sent to a Catholic school where she said the nuns were kind and gentle. Unfortunately, the stay with that family was cut short when the family was interned, and she spent most of the war years in the Jewish house. She also said that she had been abused. She was made to do housework and was treated like a servant. She attended school until 1942, and then she left to work in a hosiery factory where she learned to sew. In 1946, after the war, Ilse was finally able to join her parents in Chile in Puerto Montt. The Chilean government accepted people into Chile on the condition they didn't settle in Santiago. So anyone who came into the country had to settle further south, and Ilse's parents went to Puerto Montt. So Ilse and Hans, her brother, left by ship from Marseille, and Ilse described that they were in third class removed. They slept on bunks in the luggage hold that was infested with rats. When they finally landed in Buenos Aires in Argentina, they were stuck for 5 days. The snow over the Andes was too deep, and the train wouldn't be able to get over. So once they'd waited 5 days, they finally made the train trip to Santiago. Many of the passengers were sick because of the altitude and had to be given oxygen. At last, arriving in Santiago, they met their father, who had come to welcome them, and together made the 27-hour train trip to Puerto Montt. Ilse began to learn Spanish. She worked in her parents' shop and settled in. In 1949, she met her future husband Gunther, and they were married in 1950. Interviewing Ilse and Gunther, I heard that there were many other German families in Puerto Montt, some Jewish, others not, but they were all running away from the Nazi regime and became good friends, sharing social occasions and so on. Ilse and Gunther had 3 children, and in between she worked in the shop that her parents-in-law owned. Life was idyllic until 1960, when there was an earthquake with its epicenter in Puerto Montt. And in the early 70s, the political situation deteriorated, and the Browers could see that it was not going to be good for business any longer, and they began to think about leaving. and they arrived in New Zealand, in Auckland, on the 11th of February 1973 with their 2 younger children, and they made Auckland their home. Robert, or Bob Fental, so a transport from Prague took Bob Fental, who was 15, to freedom at the end of June 1939. He was born in Reichenberg, Liberec in Czechoslovakia, and came from a large extended family. His family, mother Paula Fental, sister Lydia Fental, and he himself were organising to immigrate to New Zealand when a relative alerted them to Nicholas Winton's Kindertransportees. Hurriedly, Robert's mother arranged for him to leave, promising to meet up with him in August for his birthday in England. In an interview with the Dominion Post later in life, Bob recalled how terrified he'd been on that journey and how grateful he later was to Sir Nicholas Winton. In England, he stayed in camps until he was able to come to New Zealand in 1940, and he was reunited there with his mother and sister. Most of the extended family died as victims of the Nazis, about 140 people. In New Zealand, he became a pilot in the Royal New Zealand Air Force in the Pacific to get back at the Nazis. He married Claire Wolfe, daughter of German Jewish refugees from Hamburg, in 1949, and settled in Wellington, having 2 children, Judy and Peter. Although Bob's schooling finished abruptly when he was 13, he studied and qualified as an architect. He joined the firm of Prischke Fental, and then becoming a partner, and later formed his own practice. He became a leading modernist Bauhaus architect and was as modest, egalitarian and unpretentious in his architecture as he was in his life. He designed affordable houses for everyday people. Perhaps he should be talking to our government if he was still alive. His architectural mark can be viewed throughout New Zealand in landmarks such as the Massey House on Lambton Quay, a Catholic church in Taihape, the Such Smith House in Brooklyn, and the heritage-listed Henry Lang House in Karori. And the best example of his architecture was his own house at 117 Wilton Road, Wellington. Bob was known as a leading environmentalist. He co-founded COINCO, later known as ECO, a nationwide coalition of over 100 environmental groups, where he guided the organisation through key environmental changes for over 20 years. He fought against the motorway destruction of the Bolton Street Settlers Cemetery in Wellington and was active in pursuing Wellington's Otari Wilton Bush from destruction. He was Jewish, though not a practicing Orthodox Jew, and his style was to shun the limelight, keeping a low profile despite his considerable achievements. He's survived by 2 grandchildren, his wife having predeceased him many years before. Lenore and Walter Freytag were born in Königsberg in East Prussia, which today is Kaliningrad, Russia. Walter was born in 1927 and Lenore, or Laura, in 1933. Their father, Hans Freytag, was a lawyer, and his wife, Trude, was originally from Chemnitz in Saxony. After Kristallnacht, the Freytag parents increased their efforts to immigrate and join Trude's sister and brother-in-law, Hilda and Hans Fraulich, I believe it's pronounced in New Zealand, and their application was not successful. And they decided to send Walter and Lenore to England by Kindertransport. Laura left first on the 14th of May 1939. She was told that Walter would follow her as soon as a home could be found for him, and their parents would follow later. Her mother accompanied Laura by train from Königsberg to Berlin, which was a journey of 7 to 8 hours. And in Berlin, she joined the Kindertransport. The journey took her by train to Holland, then by ship to Dover, England. Yet another train took them to London, where Laura was greeted by a distant cousin, Uncle David. Their meeting was long enough only for a cup of British Railways tea before another train trip to her final destination, Newcastle on Tyne. Laura was placed in a hostel for Jewish girls at 55 Percy Park, Tynemouth, and that had been established as a temporary home for Jewish refugees. At the time she arrived, there were 20 to 24 girls aged between 4 and 18 in the care of 2 matrons. In 1940, the hostel was evacuated to Windermere in the Lake District, where staff and children remained until the end of the war. Laura spent a total of 7 years in this hostel. Walter, aged 10, travelled by train from Königsberg to Berlin with his father in July 1939, and from Berlin he went via Holland also to Newcastle on Tyne. He was fostered by a working class family with 3 teenage sons. 6 weeks later, they were evacuated to a large privately owned estate near Kirby Lonsdale, which in itself is near Windermere. When the other children returned home, Walter stayed in the care of the estate's owner, who funded his attendance at the local grammar school. Laura visited him from time to time during school holidays, and after completing his school certificate in 1945, Walter got a job as an assistant industrial chemist in Newcastle. During the first year or two of the war, the children received Red Cross letters of 24 words each, until finally the last letter arrived from Königsberg in mid-1942. Records at Yad Vashem show that Hans and Trudy were deported first to Theresienstadt and then to Auschwitz. Neither they nor the children's paternal grandparents survived. After the war, the children were sent to their uncle and aunt, the Frauliches, in New Zealand. Walter and Laura arrived in Wellington on the 6th of December 1946. Hans and Hilda Fraulich had arrived in Masterton from Chemnitz in 1938, and Hans was a dentist by profession, and he'd set up a practice in Masterton, and initially Walter and Laura went to them. Eventually Walter moved to England too as a laboratory chemistry technician and studied part-time for a science degree. In 1947 he became a New Zealand citizen. He married Susan, the daughter of refugees from Chemnitz who had settled in Christchurch, and for most of his working life he was chief chemist and technical manager of BP New Zealand. He lived his adult life in the Hutt Valley but died in Turangi in 2014. Laura attended Wairarapa College, gaining school certificate in 1949. Then she worked as a governess on a farm for a year before starting training college in Wellington in 1951. She travelled widely, settling in New York for nearly 20 years, but she returned to New Zealand in 1985 and died here in 1994. And here is little Michael Goldsmith, aged 2.5, with his mum. He was born in Frankfurt am Main on the 5th of December 1936. In November 1938, when he was almost 2 years old, his mother Thea had to leave him in a home run by the Jewish Women's League called the Heim Eisenberg. She went to search for her parents. They had been ordered to leave Germany and had been deemed Polish citizens by the National Socialist government, and they'd been ordered to go back to Poland. But the Poles didn't want them either, and the family had lost track of them. So Thea left little Michael in the Heim Eisenberg and went to look for her parents. During Kristallnacht on the 9th of November 1938, the main building of the Heim Eisenberg was set on fire, and the children watched from the yard in their pyjamas. Michael's father was arrested and deported to Buchenwald concentration camp. He returned a month later, and it was clear that he had suffered badly. He lived with his mother at the Heim Eisenberg until the end of May 1939, and in June 1939 he was sent on a Kindertransport with his older sister. Arriving in England, brother and sister were taken to separate families near Marple. Michael went to a Methodist family, and his sister Eva was cared for by the Quakers. Here he is with his foster mother, Elaine Rothbell. So sometime later, both parents escaped separately, and Michael was taken back by his mother, who was employed as a housekeeper on a farm. His father, Walter, was interned as an enemy alien and sent to prison camp in Australia on the SS Dunera, which we know today is a ship that was famous for the appalling overcrowded conditions on board, the cruel treatment of the internees, and the fact that there were Nazi prisoners of war also on the ship. Walter returned to England in 1943 after the British government realised what a terrible mistake it had made and gave the men the option of returning to England or staying in Australia. So he returned to England. Michael's grandfather, Edward Jammer, was deported to Buchenwald and died in 1941, but his grandmother Jenny survived, living temporarily with the Goldsmith family in England, and then spent the final years of her life in Australia. Michael completed his education in England. He trained in agriculture at the Roseneath Agricultural College in Nantwich, Cheshire. He came to New Zealand, where his aunt and her family were living, on the 29th of April 1957, arriving in Wellington. After years spent working on farms, he eventually lived in Christchurch and Rangiora, working for the Department of Agriculture and teaching agricultural students. Michael married in 1968 and had 2 sons. Some of you may know or remember Liesl Breen, who grew up in Wellington. Philip's mother, Philip's. So Liesl Simon, she was born into a well-established Jewish family in Hamburg on the 23rd of November 1925. She lived with her brother Eric, 2 years younger, mother Vali and father Hans at 143 Mittelweg, nearby the Ulster River. At that time, Hans was director of one of Germany's largest life insurance companies, and he held that position until he died from appendicitis in 1936. They lived a reformed Jewish life, attending their temple, which stood alongside their local police station. There was a large extended family, and Liesl recalled the large numbers attending at her maternal grandmother's home for Jewish festivals. Home life was very strict, with the children being brought up by a governess. In the early 1930s, Hans talked about the family emigrating to the USA, but they remained living in Hamburg. In 1936, despite the growing anti-Jewish sentiment, Hans actually had his directorship renewed of the insurance company, but now, without a father, Liesl was living at home with her mother and brother Eric. Kristallnacht saw the temple by the police station burnt to the ground. Only 2 Sidurim, prayer books, survived. One of those found amongst the embers had belonged to Vali's mother. It survives to this day, now safely in New Zealand. The day after Kristallnacht, Liesl stood behind a curtain and watched her great-uncle being taken from his house by the Gestapo. By late 1938, it was clear to Vali that she and the children must somehow get out of Germany. Liesl was put forward to go on a Kindertransport, which left from the Bahnhof station soon after her 13th birthday. As with all of the children, she was only allowed to take what she could carry in a small suitcase, which had practical items in it and a blanket belonging to her grandfather strapped to the outside of the case. The train arrived at Calais, and from there she was put on a ship to England and put into a children's camp waiting for family allocation. Dinah and Mossy Davis took her to their home on Knights Road, Hackney, in London, where she lived with their children, Betty and Bernard. Later, Vali and her brother Eric also got to England and were taken in by a Quaker lady, Miss Seaborn. In 1940, Vali, together with Eric, sailed for New Zealand, where Vali married Walter Bear, and they settled in Wellington. It was not until later in 1941 that Liesl boarded the SS Akaroa, sailing out of Newcastle to New Zealand. She watched as 2 days out they sailed through a convoy of sinking ships and people drowning all about them. When the ship berthed in Auckland, Liesl was met by Rabbi Esther, who took her home for a meal and then put her on the train for Wellington. Her mother and Walter were there to meet her on the platform and took her to their small home in Northland, Wellington. And here are Liesl and her new husband, Issy, on their wedding day in 1946. And their 2 children are Philip, who lives in Wellington, and Valerie, who lives in Auckland. This beautiful young woman is Eva, born Diamant. She was born in Prague on the 1st of January 1924 into a warm and loving family, like most of the Kinder, and she lived in the town of Czechowicz, which was near Prague. Czech was the language of the household, and Czech patriotism was emphasised from an early age, from school and home. Czechoslovakia having gained independence and becoming a republic after the First World War, and that was greatly celebrated, that independence between the 2 world wars. Eva had one younger sister, Vera, and was very close to her parents. Her father had a business as a wine merchant and her mother worked with him. The family was not religiously observant and there were few other Jews living in the small town near Prague. On the 29th of June 1939, at the age of 15, Eva left Prague on a Kindertransport together with her sister Vera, who was 11 years old. Eva was sent to a girls' boarding school in England, where she was under the care of the principal and later adopted by the family of a school friend, the Allners. Although everyone concerned was kind and tried hard to help her settle into a different life, Eva poured her lonely, anguished heart into her diary. The diary was her answer to the intense culture shock and powerlessness she felt. She worried constantly about her parents, and particularly about her sister Vera, for whom she felt a heavy responsibility, being the older sister. Her diaries were published in 1992 as By the Moon and the Stars, and she arrived at the title by referring back to her father's parting remark to her, "If we can't communicate by letter, we will send our love by the moon and the stars." And the book By the Moon and the Stars it's in the library here, but I also bought a copy which is on the table at the back. Thank you. Eva also spoke a lot in her later years in schools and career that would enable her to help others, so she studied nursing in Poole in Dorset from 1941. In Prague, after the war, she felt that she couldn't live in Czechoslovakia anymore, and she returned to London, marrying a doctor, Michael Heyman, and they immigrated to New Zealand with their 2 young children in September 1957. In later years, Eva studied at Auckland University, achieving an MA with honours in education, and she lived the remainder of her life in Auckland, making occasional trips to England and the Czech Republic. Eva took part in Kindertransport reunions in England and was even featured in a book, Into the Arms of Strangers, and a documentary film of the same name was also made, and she spoke willingly to school and other groups about her life. And the book, Into the Arms of Strangers, is also on the back table if you would like to have a look. And I don't know if the film is still around, but it's a documentary and it's very moving to see. Her sister Vera was taken in by a loving Christian family, the Rainfords, who lived in Liverpool. Apparently, Vera was chosen by their daughter, who selected Vera from photographs of 6 girls on the basis that she liked Vera's smile. So there you go. At the end of the war, the girls heard that their mother had survived Bergen-Belsen, only to find subsequently that she had died of typhus in 1945. Eva had the truly terrible job of writing to Vera with the sad news. Their father had died on a hunger march towards the end of the war. Vera also returned to Prague for some years after the war, but escaped to England when the communists took over in Czechoslovakia. She married and stayed in England, and she also kept a diary through the war years, publishing a book called Pearls of Childhood in 1988. Vera and Eva had 2 boy cousins who were to leave on a Kindertransport from Prague on the 1st of September, and homes had been found for them, but unfortunately the train was not allowed to leave. The boys were murdered in Bergen-Belsen. Hitler had invaded Poland, and all the borders were closed. On the same transport as Eva and Vera was a little girl by the name of Vera Hart. Bob Fental, incidentally, was also on the same transport, so several of the kinder were coincidentally on the same transport. So Vera was born in Vienna, on the 7th of February 1929. The family had a cook and a personal governess for Vera, who was an only child. For some time she went to a Jewish school, but eventually she had to leave because of the anti-Semitism, and her father owned a pharmacy that was defaced during Kristallnacht with the word Yud written across the front. She was 8 years old when Kristallnacht disrupted her life. Her family went into hiding, first living away from the spotlight in her grandmother's home in Czechoslovakia, and then going from place to place and eating in soup kitchens as their flow of money ran out. Vera was put on a Kindertransport on the 30th of June 1939 and aged 10, and was taken in by a family in Sheffield in Yorkshire. It was wholly unsuitable for her. They were not Jewish, they were working class, they were totally different from the household she had come from. When she left Vienna, her father also gave her a diary with a lock, like Eva, and she poured her heart into it. When she arrived in England, Vera knew no English, although she was fluent in French, German and Czech. In an interview for the Holocaust Oral History Project in Auckland, 2001, she reported that she'd been verbally abused by her foster mother for years, referred to as Jewish bitch, ordered to do housework, and so on. Vera left school at 14 as the foster family wouldn't pay for any further education, and as soon as she could, she ran away from the household, joining the army at 17. Some months later, she met and married her Catholic husband John and became a Catholic herself. They arrived in New Zealand on the 5th of November in 1953 and had 6 children living in Wairau, as her husband John had joined the New Zealand Army. Then they came to Papakura near Auckland in 1968. Her parents were killed in Auschwitz in 1941, and the Sydney Jewish Museum has facilitated the publishing of her autobiography called Journey to Life. And here is a photograph of Eva and Vera together with Nicholas Winton at a Kindertransport reunion. They decided to go together from Auckland to the reunion, and so there they are, with very proudly with Nicholas Winton. I think it was 1989 that, and they were duly written up in the local paper, etc. Our next person, or child, is Gerhard Wachsner, who later became Gerald Warner. He was born in Charlottenburg, Berlin, Germany, on the 29th of September 1924. His father was a businessman dealing in buttons who had been a soldier in the German army during the First World War. Although he'd been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class, this was later taken away from him by the Nazi regime. Gerhard's grandparents had come to Berlin from what was then Prussia on his mother's side and Upper Silesia on his father's side. The family was not religiously observant, but Gerhard had a bar mitzvah, and the study he did in preparation for this influenced him for a while. Young Gerhard attended a state primary school, followed by 18 months at the Kaiser Friedrich Gymnasium, a high school, and in 1935 his parents moved him to the Jewish school because of the increasingly anti-Semitic atmosphere in Berlin, and particularly at the gymnasium. Gerhard and his sister both belonged to a Zionist group in Berlin. He attended a Hachshara, or an agricultural training camp in Berlin, intending to go to Palestine. This didn't eventuate, and Gerhard left Berlin on a Kindertransport for Scotland on the 1st of August 1939. His sister Anneliese eventually married and went to Palestine early in 1939. After Kristallnacht, business came to a standstill for Gerhard's father, and Gerhard and his brother Gunther became the main breadwinners. Gunther earned his wages as an apprentice. He was an apprentice brickmaker, and Gerhard by doing delivery jobs on his bike. Gunther was the first to leave Berlin. He accepted a job in Wellington as a carpenter in Wellington, New Zealand, and he landed as an 18-year-old without any connections at all. But he settled in straight away and loved it and was well received. Gerhard was still under 15, so he qualified to leave on a Kindertransport, and he was one of only 3 children on his transport who went to Glasgow. The others went to London. Gerald, as he became in Scotland, was to have gone to school and lived in a hostel with other boys. However, because war was declared, he was evacuated to a village between Perth and Dundee. There he was allocated to a farming family with 3 other boys. As soon as he could, he made his way back to Glasgow, and after taking odd jobs, accepted an apprenticeship as a piano tuner. Before he finished his training, being 18, he joined the army, was stationed in Germany from April 1945 for 2 years, and while there found out that his parents and many of their relatives hadn't survived the war. His skills as an interpreter were useful, and he translated in the law courts for the War Crimes Tribunal. In England after the war, Gerald decided to join Gunther in New Zealand, where he arrived on the 25th of October. He completed his MA degree in languages, and also decided to take a name that more closely aligned with Gunther's, so he took the surname Warner and became Gerald Alfred Warner. He eventually became head of languages in 2 Auckland secondary schools, and said in an interview for the Holocaust Oral History Project in Auckland that he had very much enjoyed teaching. Gerald married 3 times and had 3 children and 1 stepdaughter. He died in Whangarei on the 4th of July 2007, and Gunther died in Auckland in January 2017. Hans Hirsch, who later became Herb Hurst. Hans was born on the 14th of March 1929 in Königsberg, East Prussia. He had an older brother, Ernest, and a younger sister, Ruth. Their father, Erich Hirsch, had a department store in Neidenberg, also in East Prussia. His mother, Helene, had 3 sisters. The Hirsch household was firmly middle class and not religiously observant. After 1933, when Hitler came to power and East Prussia became a Nazi stronghold, and life for Jews became increasingly difficult. The family moved to Berlin, and Kristallnacht saw the family store vandalised, and Hans's father Erich was taken to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. On the 14th of March 1939, Hans, then aged 10, Ernest, aged almost 14, and Ruth, aged 7, left on a Kindertransport, and that was the last time they saw their parents. Ernest records, "I must confess, for me it was more of an adventure, and leaving my parents, we thought, was a temporary thing." The last memory he has is of his mother at the railway station in Berlin, hiding behind a pillar with tears running down her face as she waved goodbye. And this is an echo of the image that Gerald Warner gave me in his testimony when he described also how his mother said goodbye at the Berlin railway station with tears running down her face. And apparently there were 3 stations in Berlin, and their family made sure that there were family members at each station to wave him goodbye as he left. So it was I did a long interview with Gerald, and that was a lasting image that I have from the interview. Arthur Ehrlich, an uncle by marriage, had sponsored the children to come to Scotland and arranged a Jewish foster family for each child. Hans, so we are back with the Hirsch family now, Hans and Ruth were living with foster families who were brothers and sisters and formed close relationships with their foster siblings and cousins. The children remember being taken to buy clothes like the local children had, and particularly they remembered getting Wellington boots. In September 1939, 2 days before war was declared, grandfather Erich left Berlin and arrived in Scotland. However, he was classed as an enemy alien and interned on the Isle of Man. Mother Helene and her sister Jenny remained in Berlin to settle family affairs, and between 1939 and 42, many affectionate letters arrived for Erich and the children. They were full of news and questions. Are the children playing the piano? Skating? Wearing the clothes she sent? And please, could they write more often? She was desperate for a visa that never came, for any country she could get to. After 1942, no more letters arrived. Helene died in the Litzmannstadt ghetto, probably 1943. After his release from internment, Erich bought a small house, but struggled with poor mental and physical health, dying in a care home in 1953, aged 63. Meanwhile, Hans's aunt Erich Hirsch sailed from the south of France and arrived in New Zealand in 1939. She was able to leave because she had a domestic visa, and she worked as a cook for Sir Ernest Davis, Mayor of Auckland. Her husband, Ernst Ehrlich, wasn't able to join her in New Zealand until 1948. By 1950, Hans and Ruth had finished school, and Aunt and Uncle Greta and Ernst, having no children, offered to have Ruth live with them in New Zealand, where she could go to university in Auckland. Hans followed soon after, studying at Teachers Training College, and he anglicised his name to Herb Hurst and joined the army. He became a captain in the army, serving in Korea, and he was the first German-born officer in the New Zealand Army since von Temsky. Travelling the world after the war, he found a wife in Scotland, and they were married by her father, who was a Presbyterian minister. In 1960, Herb brought his family back to New Zealand, resolving to settle here. Throughout his life, he was adventurous and sporty, and clever and kind, and he kept in close contact with his brother and sister all his life. He died suddenly in 1990, aged only 60. He is survived by his brother Ernest in Scotland and his sister Ruth in the United States, as well as daughter Jenny and 2 grandchildren, Simon and Zoe. After completing her BA at the University of Auckland, Ruth won a scholarship to do postgraduate degree in social work at Brown University in the US. And for many years she worked for the Jewish Association for services aged in New York, and she was an accomplished musician. Ernest has been involved with Holocaust education in Britain for the past 20 years. From my own family, my father's cousins Eva and Anita Gretzer grew up in comfortable surroundings with the families of both parents close by. Their father Friedel ran several businesses with his father Leopold and brother Otto in the city of Olomouc, or Olmütz in Germany. This was in Moravia in the newly formed Republic of Czechoslovakia. The Gretzer family lived in a fashionable building, each on different levels, which also included the business office. And after passing through Nazi and into communist hands, the building was made into small apartments for 16 or 18 tenants who were allocated housing by the city. With Hitler invading Czechoslovakia in March 1939, at the ages of 13 and 8 respectively, Eva and Anita were farewelled in Prague by their parents. They managed to get permission for the girls to be taken to London on the 4th Kindertransport. The promise was that their parents would soon join them. Eva, of course, was charged with caring for her younger sister, which was a responsibility that burdened her for the rest of her life. The two sisters were always close. They were initially put into a boarding school in the south of London, which they both really hated. And after a few months, their uncle and aunt and their two children, who'd been able to reach London, took the girls in and for several years became their family. For the 2 to 3 years, there was very brief, spasmodic communication with the parents, but it wasn't until 1944-45 they found out that in 1942, Herta and Friedel, along with the grandparents, other aunts and extended family from Olmütz, were transported to Theresienstadt and shortly after to Baranovice, where they were murdered. A small number of their immediate Gretzer family managed to escape or evade the Nazis and made their homes in the UK and the US. Some of their mother's family, including those who cared for Eva and Anita, also managed to eventually become established in the UK and the US and even in New Zealand. So Eva learned the millinery trade in London, and at 19 she married Kurt Weinstein, who had migrated from Stuttgart. In England, Kurt became Ken. Their son Eric was born in 1947, and in 1952 they migrated to New Zealand, where they joined our family in Auckland. For many years, Eva ran a ladies' millinery store in Auckland, supplying much of the North Island, and their son Eric described to me how twice a year his mother would load up her little Morris Minor with her sample hats and travel all the way around the North Island with her samples, getting orders for hats. But of course the changing fashions put paid to much of that trade when hats went out of fashion, and she then pursued a cosmetics career with a leading Auckland brand and then continued in Sydney from the late 1960s. She and Ken divorced, and in Sydney she married Alan Binder, also from Europe, in 1977. However, he sadly died shortly after the wedding. Ken changed his name by deed poll from Weinstein to Winton in 1948. He remained in Auckland, where he died in 2002. Ken's parents were transported to Theresienstadt and murdered at Treblinka. Sister Anita's desire to be with Eva drew her to New Zealand in 1959, but after 4 years she made the move to Sydney, where she married Jack Chard, who in Europe had been known as Isaac Yamovich. They created a family with 2 children, Deborah and Gary, and established a lifelong enterprise in restaurants and coffee lounges. Eva's son Eric today lives in Sydney with 2 married sons and their families. So that completes the 13 stories. I wanted to read a bit of this letter from the chief rabbi that was written to the kinder at the end of the war. My dear young friend, at the present great moment when, I think you probably can't read it there, so that's why I'm reading, when the war in Europe is coming to an end, I should like to say a few words to you. The past 6 years of war have been a time of incredible suffering to many nations, but to Israel they have been a martyrdom. We have all lived through years of anxiety and agony, have often lifted our eyes to our Father in heaven in prayer for our near and dear ones far away who are fighting the enemy on the battlefield or were victims of his evil arm. Now that the armies of the Allied nations have broken the mighty forces of tyranny in Europe, we offer our thanks to Almighty God. And we call to mind our brethren and friends who have given their lives for the sacred cause of freedom, and the martyrs who agonized in concentration camps. Their memory will remain an inspiration and a blessing. I know how happy you are to have received so much kindness from your foster parents, and hope that you will equally be aware of the love and devotion you received as a child from your own parents and relatives. And he ends by inviting them to a synagogue service to celebrate victory in Europe. I see that ultimately the stories to me are stories of hope, and despite the stolen childhoods that most of the kinder settled to live fulfilling lives after the war, studying as universities and other tertiary institutions despite the poverty of their formal education, and they married and had families of their own. They lived their adult lives as contributing individuals to the patchwork of New Zealand society, and today we salute them. And I would like to personally thank Helene, Philip, Irene, Howard, Mike, Jenny, Joanna and Shirley for their input in helping me collect this information. And when I got to the end of this project, I looked at what the information I had, and the 13 children whose lives I'd studied, and came up with what I thought was some commonalities that I will share with you, and you might have some yourself to add. So it seems that they all came from loving, nurturing families, and most of the families that they came from were professional and business families. It seems that most of them came from fairly secular, although very Jewish households. Many had difficulty in forming relationships in later life, not all, but many. Most of them identified as being Jewish, but not many became members of Jewish congregations. All had their education disrupted, and yet they achieved amazing qualifications and success in their later lives. And above all, they suffered extreme dislocation, and not just once, in some cases, where they went to a family and then were evacuated when war was declared, or one family didn't work out. The one family was interned on the Isle of Man, and so they then were, dislocated again when they were given to another family. And yet, despite this, they survived.